I'm reading on with Chapter 5 of Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. Continuing with Chapter 5, Christ as a Symbol of the Self. Paragraph 73. The God image in man that was damaged by the first sin can be reformed with the help of God, in accordance with Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God. The totality images which the unconscious produces in the course of an individuation process are similar reformations of an a priori archetype, the mandala. As I have already emphasized, the spontaneous symbols of the self, or of wholeness, cannot in practice be distinguished from a God image. Despite the word be transformed in the Greek text of the above quotation, the renewal, reformation, of the mind is not meant as an actual alteration of consciousness, but rather as the restoration of an original condition, an Apocatastatis. This is in exact agreement with the empirical findings of psychology that there is an ever-present archetype of wholeness, which may easily disappear from the purview of consciousness, or may never be perceived at all, until a consciousness illuminated by conversion recognizes it in the figure of Christ. As a result of this anamnesis, the original state of oneness with the God image is restored. It brings about an integrating, a bridging of the split of the personality caused by the instincts striving apart in different and mutually contradictory directions. The only time the split does not occur is when a person is still as legitimately unconscious of his instinctual life as an animal. But it proves harmful and impossible to endure when an artificial unconsciousness, a repression, no longer reflects the life of the instincts. Paragraph 74. There can be no doubt that the original Christian conception of the Imago Dei embodied in Christ meant an all-embracing totality that even includes the animal side of man. Nevertheless, the Christ symbol lacks wholeness in the modern psychological sense, since it does not include the dark side of things, but specifically excludes it in the form of a Luciferian opponent. Although the exclusion of the power of evil was something the Christian consciousness was well aware of, all it lost in effect was an insubstantial shadow, for, through the doctrine of the privatio boni first propounded by Origen, evil was characterized as a mere diminution of good and thus deprived of substance. According to the teachings of the Church, evil is simply the accidental lack of perfection. This assumption resulted in the proposition omne bonum ad Deo, omne malum ab homine. Another logical consequence was that the subsequent elimination of the devil in certain Protestant sects. My rough translation of the Latin is, all good is of God, all bad is of man. Paragraph 75. Thanks to the doctrine of the privatio boni, wholeness seemed guaranteed in the figure of Christ. One must, however, take evil rather more substantially when one meets it on the plane of empirical psychology. There it is simply the opposite of good. In the ancient world, the Gnostics, whose arguments were very much influenced by psychic experience, tackled the problem of evil on a broader base than the Church Fathers. For instance, one of the things they taught was that Christ cast off his shadow from himself. If we give this view the weight it deserves, we can easily recognize the cut-off counterpart in the figure of Antichrist. The Antichrist develops in legend as a perverse imitator of Christ's life. He is a true imitating spirit of evil who follows in Christ's footsteps, like a shadow following the body. This complementing of the bright but one-sided figure of the Redeemer, we even find traces of it in the New Testament. There's a footnote to the statement, Christ cast off his shadow from himself. The footnote reads, Irenaeus records the Gnostic teaching that when Christ, as the demiurge Logos, created his mother's being, he cast her out of the pleroma. That is, he cut her off from knowledge. For creation took place outside the pleroma, in the shadow and the void. According to Valentinus, Christ did not spring from the eons of the pleroma, but from the mother who was outside of it. She bore him, he says, not without a kind of shadow, but he, being masculine, cast off the shadow from himself and returned to the pleroma, while his mother, being left behind in the shadow and deprived of spiritual substance, gave birth to the real demiurge and pantocrator of the lower world. But the shadow which lies over the world is, as we know from the Gospels, the princeps huius mundi, the devil. From the writings of Irenaeus, Volume 1, page 45 and following. Paragraph 76. If we see the traditional figure of Christ as a parallel to the psychic manifestation of the self, then the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of the self, namely the dark half of the human totality, which ought not to be judged too optimistically. So far as we can judge from experience, light and shadow are so evenly distributed in man's nature that his psychic totality appears, to say the least of it, in a somewhat murky light. The psychological concept of the self, in part derived from our knowledge of the whole man, but for the rest depicting itself spontaneously in the products of the unconscious, as an archetypal quaternity bound together by inner antinomies, cannot omit the shadow that belongs to the light figure, for without it, this figure lacks body and humanity. In the empirical self, light and shadow form a paradoxical unity. In the Christian concept, on the other hand, the archetype is hopelessly split into two irreconcilable halves, leading ultimately to a metaphysical dualism, the final separation of the kingdom of heaven from the fiery world of the damned. Paragraph 77. For anyone who has a positive attitude towards Christianity, the problem of the Antichrist is a hard nut to crack. It is nothing less than the counterstroke of the devil provoked by God's incarnation. For the devil attains his true stature as the adversary of Christ, and hence of God, only after the rise of Christianity, while as late as the book of Job, he was still one of God's sons and on familiar terms with Yahweh. Psychologically, the case is clear, since the dogmatic figure of Christ is so sublime and spotless that everything else turns dark beside it. It is, in fact, so one-sidedly perfect that it demands a psychic complement to restore the balance. This inevitable opposition led very early to the doctrine of the two sons of God, of whom the elder was called Satanel. The coming of the Antichrist is not just a prophetic prediction, it is an inexorable psychological law whose existence, though unknown to the author of the Johannine epistles, brought him a sure knowledge of the impending enantiodromia. Consequently, he wrote as if he were conscious of the inner necessity for this transformation, though we may be sure that the idea seemed to him like a divine revelation. In reality, every intensified differentiation of the Christ image brings about a corresponding accentuation of its unconscious complement, thereby increasing the tension between above and below.